The sun was just beginning to rise over Washington, casting a golden hue over the city.
The streets were still quiet, the usual hustle and bustle yet to begin. In the heart of the city stood a modest church, its steeple reaching towards the heavens. It was a place of solace for many, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. But today, it would become the stage for an unexpected encounter. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows hiding the identity of its passenger. The door opened, and out stepped a man dressed in a long, dark coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, and a pair of oversized sunglasses that obscured his eyes. He moved quickly, his head down, as if trying to avoid any attention. The man was Donald Trump, the former President of the United States, though no one would have recognized him in this disguise. Trump had always been a man of contradictions, brash and outspoken in public, yet deeply private in his personal life. Today, he sought something he rarely allowed himself, a moment of quiet reflection. The weight of his past decisions, the constant scrutiny, and the relentless pressure of his public life had driven him to seek solace in the one place he thought he could find it, a church. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the soft glow of candlelight flickering against the stained glass windows. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the faint sound of a choir singing hymns echoed through the halls. Trump removed his hat and sunglasses, though he kept his head low, his face partially hidden by the collar of his coat. He made his way to a pew near the back of the church and knelt down, his hands clasped in front of him. For a moment, he simply sat there, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. He hadn't prayed in years, not truly. Prayer had always felt like a performance, something he did for the cameras, for the voters. But today, it was different. Today, he felt a need, a desperate, aching need, to connect with something greater than himself. He began to whisper, his voice barely audible, the words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. "Lord, I don't know if you're listening. I don't even know if I believe in you anymore. But if you are there, if you can hear me, I need your help. I've made mistakes. I've done things I'm not proud of. But I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. I don't know how." His voice cracked, and he paused, his hands trembling. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. For the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable, exposed. It was a feeling he hated, but one he couldn't escape. As he continued to pray, he became aware of a presence nearby. He opened his eyes and glanced to his left. A priest was standing a few feet away, his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. Trump quickly looked away, his heart racing. He hadn't expected anyone to be here this early. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. The priest approached slowly, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. He stopped a few feet from the pew and cleared his throat. "Good morning," the priest said, his voice calm and measured. "I didn't expect to see anyone here at this hour." Trump hesitated, his mind racing. He had to be careful. If the priest recognized him, it could ruin everything. He kept his head down, his voice low and gruff. "Just needed a moment of peace," he muttered. The priest nodded, though his eyes lingered on Trump for a moment longer than necessary. There was something about the man that seemed off. His clothes were expensive, but they smelled faintly of mothballs and old cologne. His posture was tense, his movements stiff. And then there was his face, partially hidden, but familiar in a way the priest couldn't quite place. "Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you like," the priest said finally. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Trump nodded, but didn't respond. He waited until the priest had walked away before letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced around the church, his eyes scanning the empty pews, the flickering candles, the towering crucifix above the altar. For a moment, he felt a sense of peace, a fleeting, fragile peace that he hadn't felt in years. But it didn't last. As he turned back to the front, he noticed another priest approaching, this one younger, with a stern expression on his face. The man stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. "Excuse me," the younger priest said, his voice sharp. But we don't allow loitering in the church. If you're not here to pray, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Trump's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, not by anyone. He clenched his fists, his temper flaring. "I am praying," he snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "Or is that not allowed anymore?" The priest's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "We also don't tolerate disrespect," he said coldly. "If you can't conduct yourself properly, I'll have to escort you out." Trump stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He towered over the priest, his face red with anger. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he growled. "I could have this place shut down with a single phone call." The priest didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on Trump's. "I don't care who you are," he said evenly. "This is a house of God. You will show respect, or you will leave." For a moment, the two men stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. The air between them was thick with tension, the sound of their breathing the only noise in the otherwise silent church. Finally, Trump broke the silence. He let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Otherwise, you'd be out of a job." The priest didn't respond. He simply stood there, his arms crossed, his expression unyielding. Trump grabbed his hat and sunglasses and stormed out of the church, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the empty halls, a harsh reminder of the confrontation that had just taken place. Outside, the sun was fully risen now, the city coming to life around him. Trump stood on the steps of the church, his chest heaving, his mind racing. He had come here seeking peace, but instead, he had found only more conflict. He put on his sunglasses and pulled his hat low over his face, his disguise once again in place. As he walked back to his waiting SUV, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, he had other things to worry about. The world was waiting, and Donald Trump had a reputation to uphold. The younger priest, Father Michael, watched as the mysterious man stormed out of the church, his heavy footsteps echoing through the sanctuary. He exchanged a glance with the older priest, Father Thomas, who had been observing the interaction from a distance. Father Thomas approached, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What was that about?" Father Thomas asked, his voice low. Father Michael shook his head, his arms still crossed tightly over his chest. "I don't know, but he was disrespectful. He threatened to shut down the church. Who does he think he is?" Father Thomas frowned, his gaze drifting toward the door. "Did you recognize him? There was something familiar about him." "No," Father Michael replied, though he hesitated. "But he was hiding his face. Sunglasses, a hat, a coat pulled up to his chin. He didn't want to be recognized."
The two priests stood in silence for a moment, the tension from the encounter still lingering in the air.
The church, usually a place of peace, now felt charged with an unspoken unease. Meanwhile, outside, Trump stood by his SUV, his mind racing. He had come here to escape the chaos of his life, but instead, he had been met with hostility. The nerve of that priest, talking to him like he was some kind of common troublemaker. He clenched his fists, his pride wounded. He wasn't used to being dismissed, not by anyone. But as he stood there, a part of him wondered if he had overreacted. Maybe he shouldn't have lost his temper. Maybe he should have just walked away. But no, he couldn't let anyone talk to him like that. He was Donald Trump, for God's sake. He didn't have to take that kind of treatment from anyone. Before he could get into the car, he heard the church doors open behind him. He turned to see the two priests stepping outside, their expressions stern. Father Michael was leading the way, his eyes locked on Trump. "Sir," Father Michael called out, his voice firm. "We need to have a word with you." Trump raised an eyebrow, his irritation flaring again.
"Oh, now you want to talk."
"What? You think you can just kick me out and then come after me? You've got some nerve." Father Thomas stepped forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Please, let's not escalate this. We just want to understand why you're here. This is a place of worship, and we take that very seriously." Trump scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "I was here to pray. Isn't that what this place is for? Or is that too much to ask?" Father Michael's jaw tightened. "You were disrespectful. You threatened us. That's not how we conduct ourselves here." "Disrespectful?" Trump shot back, his voice rising. "You're the one who came at me like I was some kind of criminal. I didn't come here to be judged by a couple of priests who think they're better than everyone else." Father Thomas stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Enough. This isn't helping anyone. Sir, if you came here seeking peace, then let's find a way to resolve this peacefully. But if you continue to cause a disturbance, we will have no choice but to ask you to leave." Trump glared at them, his temper simmering just beneath the surface. He wanted to lash out, to put them in their place, but something held him back. Maybe it was the way Father Thomas spoke, calm, measured, but with an underlying strength. Or maybe it was the realization that he was making a scene, and that was the last thing he needed. "Fine," Trump muttered, though his tone was still sharp. "But you should know who you're dealing with. You don't just talk to people like that and expect to get away with it." Father Michael opened his mouth to respond, but Father Thomas placed a hand on his arm, silencing him. "We're not here to argue," Father Thomas said. "We're here to serve. If you need help, we're willing to listen. But if you're here to cause trouble, then we can't allow that." Trump stared at them for a long moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken challenge in their words. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave this whole mess behind. But another part of him, a deeper, more stubborn part, refused to back down. "You think you're so high and mighty," Trump said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "But you're no better than anyone else. You hide behind your robes and your crosses, but you're just as flawed as the rest of us." Father Michael's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Father Thomas stepped forward. "We're all flawed," he said quietly. "That's why we're here. To seek forgiveness, to find redemption. Isn't that why you came?" Trump hesitated, the words hitting him harder than he expected. He looked away, his jaw clenched. For a moment, the anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else, something raw and vulnerable. But then the moment passed, and the mask slipped back into place. "I don't need your lectures," he snapped.
"I don't need anything from you."
With that, he turned and climbed into his SUV, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and he sped off, leaving the two priests standing in the shadow of the church. Father Michael let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. Who does he think he is? Coming here, causing a scene, acting like he owns the place. Father Thomas watched as the SUV disappeared down the street, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he said slowly. "But there's more to him than his letting on. Did you see the way he looked when I mentioned redemption? There's something he's carrying, something heavy." Father Michael shook his head. "Maybe. But that doesn't give him the right to treat us like that." "No," Father Thomas agreed. "But perhaps it's not about rights. Perhaps it's about understanding."
"We're all fighting our own battles, Michael."
"Even him." The two priests stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling over them. The church loomed behind them, its doors still open, a silent reminder of the sanctuary it was meant to be. But for now, the peace of the morning had been shattered, and the echoes of the confrontation lingered in the air. The SUV screeched to a halt a few blocks away from the church. Trump sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, frustration, and something else he couldn't quite place. He had come to the church seeking solace, but instead, he had been met with judgment and confrontation. The nerve of those priests, talking to him like he was some kind of common troublemaker. It infuriated him. But as he sat there, his anger began to give way to something else, curiosity. Who were they to judge him? Who were they to tell him how to behave? He had half a mind to turn the car around and give them a piece of his mind. But then he remembered the look in Father Thomas's eyes, calm, steady, but with a depth of understanding that had caught him off guard. It was that look that had made him hesitate, that had made him walk away instead of escalating the situation. Trump let out a frustrated sigh and reached up to adjust his sunglasses. As he did, he caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror. His face was partially hidden by the hat and glasses, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he just stared at his reflection, as if seeing himself for the first time. Who was he trying to fool with this disguise? Who was he trying to be? With a sudden burst of determination, he pulled off the hat and sunglasses and tossed them onto the passenger seat. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind made up. He wasn't going to run away. He wasn't going to let them think they had won. He was Donald Trump, and he didn't back down from anyone. He turned the car around and headed back to the church. When Trump walked back into the church, the two priests were still standing near the entrance, deep in conversation. They looked up as the doors swung open, their expressions shifting from surprise to confusion as they recognized the man standing before them.
"Mr. Trump,"
Father Thomas said, his voice filled with disbelief. Trump straightened his coat and walked toward them, his head held high. "That's right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I think we need to finish our conversation." Father Michael's eyes widened, and he took a step back, clearly caught off guard. I didn't realize it was you," he stammered. "I'm sorry if we—" "Save it," Trump interrupted, holding up a hand. "You didn't know who I was, and that's fine. But let's get one thing straight. I don't care who you are or what you think you know about me."
"You don't get to talk to me like that."
"No one does." Father Thomas stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture.
"Mr. Trump, please."
"We didn't mean to offend you. We were just trying to maintain the sanctity of this place. If we overstepped, we apologize." Trump crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unyielding. "You think an apology is enough? You think you can just say sorry and everything's fine? I could have this place shut down. I could have you both fired. You have no idea the kind of power I have." Father Michael's face paled, but Father Thomas remained calm. "We understand that," he said quietly. "But we're not here to wield power. We're here to serve. If you feel we've wronged you, then tell us how we can make it right." Trump stared at them, his mind racing. He had expected them to cower, to beg for forgiveness. But instead, they stood their ground, their eyes steady and unafraid. It was infuriating, but also admirable. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Trump let out a breath and shook his head. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," he said, his tone softer now. "I could ruin you both. But I'm not going to. Not because you deserve it, but because I think you actually believe in what you're doing." Father Thomas nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips.
"Thank you, Mr. Trump."
"That means a lot." Trump waved a hand dismissively.
"Don't thank me.
Just be better.
You want to serve?
Then serve. But don't judge people before you know their story. You have no idea what I've been through, what I'm dealing with." Father Michael stepped forward, his expression earnest.
"You're right.
We don't. And for that, we're truly sorry. We let our pride get in the way, and that's not what we're here for." Trump looked at them, his anger slowly giving way to something else, something softer, more reflective. He had come here seeking peace, and in a strange way, he had found it. Not in the way he expected, but in the way he needed. "All right," he said finally. Let's just leave it at that. I'm not going to shut down your church. I'm not going to fire you. But don't think for a second that I've forgotten this.
You owe me."
Father Thomas nodded, his smile widening.
"Understood.
And if you ever need to talk, our doors are always open." Trump gave a curt nod and turned to leave. As he reached the doors, he paused and looked back at them. "You know, you're not so bad. For priests, anyway." With that, he walked out of the church, the doors swinging shut behind him. The two priests watched him go, their expressions a mix of relief and gratitude. "Do you think he meant it?" Father Michael asked quietly. About not shutting us down.
Father Thomas chuckled softly.
I think he did. But more importantly, I think he needed this. We all did. Outside, Trump climbed back into his SUV and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He felt lighter, somehow, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't the same man who had walked into that church earlier that morning. He started the car and drove off, the church fading into the distance behind him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, a fragile, fleeting peace, but peace nonetheless. And as he drove, he couldn't help but smile.